I'm going to begin with the blessing for Torah study, which ends Vitzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So you can say it with me, or you can answer Amen at the end. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kichanu b'mitzvotav vitzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. I want to thank everybody for being here. It's been a pleasure to learn throughout the year at MakomDC here at Addis, Israel. If you're new, welcome. Introduce yourself. Not now, wait until after. But we would love to get to know you. At MakomDC at Addis, Israel has been a place of deep exploration over the course of the year into ideas about Jewish life through Open Beit Midrash, Chavruta study. We're grappling with text together. We're hearing from master teachers and scholars. We're doing some hands-on work. Last week we roasted coffee here at Addis, Israel as part of MakomDC in the K kitchen, which was used. It was brought back to life, and it was good. This month we've been talking about elasticity, boundaries, the boundaries we set for ourselves, the boundaries other people set for us, and what it means to live somewhere in them, pushing and pulling and really exploring our own elasticity and our communal elasticity. And so we are excited and honored to have Rabbi Leon Morris, who has been thinking and teaching on issues like this for quite some time. So I'm going to read the official bio. That's the professional thing to do. I'll say something else as well. So you actually have it here. Do you want to follow along? You could follow along with me. Sorry, is that awkward? Rabbi Leon Morris is Shalom Hartman Institute of North America Vice President for Programs in Israel. He previously served as rabbi of Temple Addis, Israel. It's like our not evil stepbrother. In Sag Harbor, New York, and was the founding director of the Skirball Center for Adult Jewish Learning at Temple Emmanuel in Manhattan. Ordained from Hebrew Union College in 1997, where he was a Wexner Graduate Fellow, Rabbi Morris has worked extensively as an educator with the Jewish community of India. In addition to teaching at Skirball, he has taught at Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform synagogues, as well as Drisha Institute for Jewish Education. He has contributed essays to a variety of publications, has appeared on NPR and PBS, and is editor of the new Reform High Holiday Prayer Book, a true masterpiece, Mishkan HaNefesh. Welcome to Addis, Israel, and to MakomDC. It's incredible to collaborate with you. It's also powerful to collaborate with the Shalom Hartman Institute, who has been leading a conversation in North America and Israel and really around the world about how Jews interact with one another and what are the core ideas that animate us, and really the conversation throughout this country is changing, and a lot of that has to do with the Shalom Hartman Institute, and so it's also a privilege in that respect to be collaborating. So we welcome you and thank you in advance for your Torah.
Thank you, Rabbi Alexander. It's great to be with all of you. Many of us, both from before I moved to Israel and now from Israel, have been following the growth and dynamism of this synagogue. So it's wonderful to be here. It's also good to know the congregation that took the domain name that my little synagogue in Sag Harbor wanted. We had to go with templeadasisrael.org. And it's great to be in D.C., which I haven't been to in many, many years. My cousin Pam is joining us tonight, and her parents, my aunt and uncle, brought me to Washington, D.C. My very first time. And my sister and I were staying with them in South Jersey for the summer, or a good part of the summer, and I remember my uncle saying, we have a surprise for you. Where have you always wanted to visit and have never been? And I said, Jerusalem? I said, Washington, D.C. So now I live in Jerusalem, and it's wonderful to come here to Washington. That other answer to my Uncle Lenny's question. I appreciate the structure of your learning to take a theme like elasticity and to give thought to how that theme can be developed by various sources in our tradition. So what I plan to do tonight is, together with you, is to look at some really rich and wonderful sources. First, that focus on the way in which Torah itself is elastic, or the way that we've understood Torah in our rabbinic tradition is elastic. To focus on the elasticity of our understanding of God, and then thinking about, well, what is the place where the elasticity of Torah and the elasticity of God come together? And that's a space like this space, the Beit Midrash, the house of study. So before we turn to the text, everybody has, a copy of the text? Anybody doesn't? There's probably a, right, they're in the back, okay. I want to just open by saying that I think that there's often an assumption that flexibility and elasticity in religious life is somehow less serious, less religious, and less demanding. And I hope that by the sources that we look at tonight, I hope to counter that. We want our Torah to be a Torah Chaim, to be a living Torah, a dynamic Torah. We want the Torah to have greater applicability to the world in which we live. And it's not the case that stringency is more religious or more serious than leniency. And this isn't just a debate between Orthodox and non-Orthodox. I think that often we non-Orthodox Jews are complicit in flexibility and leniency and elasticity being seen as not serious or not religious. The real question is, how seriously committed are we to allowing Torah to address the major issues of our day, and what sort of elasticity is required in order to respond to our times and to the issues of our times? I think that when we talk about the elasticity of Torah, the topics that we're talking about connect very deeply, very closely, correspond very closely with the kinds of issues that everyone in Washington and everyone in the country are talking about this week after the passing of Justice Scalia. We're talking about issues of originalism. We're talking about whether, when we look at the Torah, whether we are loose constructionists or strict constructionists. So I just want to kind of call our attention that a lot of these issues of interpretation connect very closely to Inyanei Diyoma, to issues of the day. So the first example, if you look at the first two sources, the first example that I want to bring of the elasticity of Torah is the way in which the rabbis reread the famous story of Moses breaking the Ten Commandments when the people are worshiping the golden calf. Most of us, I think, are very heavily influenced by two things when we think of that story. We're heavily influenced by the pshat, by the straightforward, contextual way that the Torah itself tells us the story. And we're influenced by Cecil B. DeMille, the Ten Commandments. And in both, in the Torah itself, the straightforward reading, and in the movie, Moses breaks the tablets in a kind of temper tantrum, in a fit of anger over this this deep sin of the people worshiping the golden calf. But the rabbis didn't see Moses' action as an uncontrolled fit of anger. They saw it as something very, very important that he was doing. And to show you one way in which they celebrated his breaking of the tablets, I want you to look with me. What you see here, Exodus chapter 34, this is the command to go back up for the second set of tablets. But look at verse number 1. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, psol lecha shnei luchot avanim karishonim. Then the Eternal said to Moses, carve yourselves 2 tablets of stone like the first ones. V'chatavti al haluchot et hadivarim, asher hayu al haluchot harishonim, asher shibarta. And I will write on the tablets the words that were on the first tablets, which you smashed. The Bible generally speaks with what biblical scholars call the economy of verse. It speaks succinctly. It uses as few words as possible. So when we see that Moses is commanded to go back up on the mountain and to receive a second set of tablets, and God says, I'm going to give you a second set of tablets to replace the first tablets, which you smashed, our assumption is what? Why those extra words, which you smashed? Okay, kind of rubbing it in his face, right? It's a little bit of a zetz. But the rabbis, the rabbinic interpretive tradition, in several places, rereads the words asher shibarta, which you smashed, as, good source number 2, God said to Moses, Yasher koach, that you smashed them. Yasher koach is what you say after someone has an aliyah or some honor. It means may your strength increase, but colloquially it's like, good for you, good for you. So the words asher shibarta, which you smashed, the rabbis are saying, sounds like congratulations for smashing them. Good for you. Thank you for smashing them, Moses. How do they do this? Why do they do this? Probably a number of reasons why Moshe gets a congratulations that you smashed the tablets. And in fact, this midrash, this piece of Talmudic Agadah that reads it as good for you that you smashed them, is part of Rashi's last comment on the entire Torah. That's how important it is. So one reason that it's so important is that in the rabbinic imagination, the 2 sets of the 10 Commandments, the 2 sets of tablets, are representative of the 2 forms of Torah. The first set of tablets is the written Torah, Torah shebichtav. Moshe breaks those, and what becomes possible in the second set of tablets is the oral Torah. The oral Torah is the expansive, interpretive, rabbinic tradition. So one of the reasons that the rabbis imagine God saying, Yasher koach, good for you, Moshe, that you broke the tablets, is that breaking of the first set of tablets is what enabled oral Torah to enter the world. This flexible, expansive, elastic, living, interpretive tradition. Their argument to see the second set of tablets as a kind of paradigm for the interpretive world of oral Torah, you can find in those verses from Exodus themselves. Look back with me, please, at verse 1. Right? God says to Moses, carve yourself, psolacha, carve for yourself 2 tablets. The first set was entirely by God. The second set, the writing will be God, but the outline of the tablets themselves will be carved by Moses. This is a great paradigm for oral Torah. It's dependent on human creativity and human initiative. And then we're told in verse 4, again, in case we missed it, Vayifsol shnei luchot avanim karishonim. Moses carved 2 tablets of stone like the first. In an amazing and imaginative essay that some of you might have read, Sigmund Freud writes an essay on the Moses of Michelangelo. Sigmund Freud visits Rome for the first time in 1901, and he becomes obsessed with that famous statue of Moses with the horns that's in the Church of St. Peter in Chains. And he writes an essay in which he imagines that Michelangelo improved upon the biblical text because in the statue, the tablets aren't broken. And in this amazing essay, Freud says Michelangelo's Moses came to his senses and exercised self-restraint and didn't break the tablets. So if Freud thinks Michelangelo recast the biblical Moses, well, the rabbis also recast the biblical Moses. But if Michelangelo recast the biblical Moses by having Moses not break the tablets, then the rabbis recast the biblical Moses by having him break the tablets as an act of great prophecy and a great contribution to the future of Jewish life. This notion of oral Torah as expansive is captured beautifully in a book by one of my teachers, Mark Ellen Waknin. This is source number 3, in which he writes, every era must understand the text in its own way. The real meaning of a text, as it addresses itself to the interpreter, does not depend on accidental factors concerning the author and his original audience, or at least these conditions do not exhaust its meaning. And so one can state that the meaning of a text, if it is a great text, not just occasionally, but always escapes its author. That is why understanding is not simply a reproductive attitude, but is always a productive one. So this idea, I think, is that revelation of Torah is also not a one-time event. It is, and the job of those who teach Torah is not to reproduce the revelation, but to produce it, to be productive. Louis Finkelstein, who was the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, wrote in the introduction to Solomon Schechter's Aspects of Rabbinic Theology. This captures the notion as well, source number 4, that the Torah is at once perfect and perpetually incomplete. That, like the universe, it was created to be a process rather than a system, a method of inquiry into the right rather than a codified collection of answers, is to share the labor of divinity. So how does this notion of an expansive, interpretive nature of Torah, how does it relate to the fact that those who are doing this interpretation, human beings, are so diverse from the other and will have different opinions? In other words, given human variety, what are the implications of all the differences that exist between us and this elastic, expansive Torah? So for this, I want to turn to source number 5, a beautiful midrash, Pesikta de Rav Kahana. And this is the first source that we're looking at that takes this notion of an expansive, interpretive Torah and tries to reconcile it with the fact that each of us is going to understand Torah in a somewhat different way. The divine word spoke to each and every person according to his particular capacity. And do not wonder at this, for when manna came down for Israel, each and every person tasted it in according with his own capacity. Infants in keeping with their capacity, young men in keeping with their capacity, and old men in keeping with their capacity. Now, if each and every person was enabled to taste the manna according to his particular capacity or her particular capacity, how much more and more was each and every person enabled according to his particular capacity to hear the divine word? So this idea of comparing Torah to manna is, I think, is just stunningly beautiful here. And we can already see in this text that there's a distinction that's very subtle here between what God says and what we hear. God is not limited. God is not subjective. But we each hear God's word in a different way. God speaks perhaps in a single voice, but each of us hears it differently, just like each of us experienced the taste of the manna differently. And of course, this then leads to, it could lead to real confusion, because when you then try to shape Jewish public policy, when you try to make laws, when you try to have a whole community united around a certain practice, how would this work? How does an individual Jew determine what his or her sense of duty and obligation is if there's such diversity of opinion, if people are hearing Torah in such different ways? So take a look with me, please, at source number 6, in which the Talmud is taking a verse from Ecclesiastes, the book of Kohelet, which it says, "The words of the wise are as goads, and as nails well planted are the words of masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd." And first, the Talmud's going to tell us why the Torah is like a goad, but I'm interested in the part of masters of assembly, ba'alei asufot. How are the words of Torah like masters of assembly? It's not at all clear what this verse means, which is why the Talmud can offer us something fresh here. So if you look on page 3 of that same source, the second paragraph, the masters of assemblies, ba'alei asupot, these are the disciples of the wise who sit in manifold assemblies and occupy themselves with Torah, some pronouncing unclean, and others pronouncing clean, some prohibiting and others permitting, some disqualifying and others declaring fit. So you have among these masters of assemblies, the Talmud is saying you're going to have different schools of thought. And on many, many issues, these schools of thought, these groups of Torah interpreters, will be diametrically opposed to each other. So then they ask the practical question, which is kind of a more eloquently stated question of what I was raising a few minutes ago, which is, how do you make any decisions then? How in these circumstances shall I learn Torah? Therefore, the text says, all of them are given from one shepherd. One God gave them. One leader uttered them from the mouth of the Lord of all creation. Blessed be he, for it is written, and God spoke all these words. And then we're told, and do thou make thine ear, let's make that a little bit easier English, make your ear like an afar keset, like a hopper, like a funnel. Make your ear like a funnel and get yourself a perceptive heart to understand the words of those who pronounce unclean and the words of those who pronounce clean, the words of those who prohibit and the words of those who permit, the words of those who disqualify and the words of those who declare fit. Make our ear and make our heart able to accommodate this dialectic, these opposing positions, make ourselves open, and that's how we can live with this kind of dissonance of the sources. Our religious life isn't threatened by it. It seems to be that our lives are enhanced by it. Our understanding is increased by this multiplicity of opinions. So in the text that we just looked at, this refers to a difference of opinion in a particular period of time in which we live. Right? There are those who are for and those who are against, those who think that it's permitted and those who think that it's prohibited. But what about the elasticity of Torah over the long arc of history? Source number 7 is a story that many of you have seen before, but I want to bring it into our conversation about the elasticity of Torah over time. Right? Again, we've been talking about the elasticity of Torah within the time in which we're living, having different interpretations, multiple views. But what about elasticity over the arc of history? So here is a story in which it's kind of the Talmudic version of Back to the Future, in which Moses is transported into the future of Rabbi Akiva's classroom. Rabbi Akiva, living around the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt, about 135, and the greatest of the rabbinic tradition. So Rav Judah said in the name of Rav, when Moses ascended on high, he found the Blessed Holy One, God, engaged in affixing coronets to the letters. This is, in the rabbi's imagination, God is basically like writing a Torah scroll. And you know, the font for the Torah has all those beautiful little crowns. And Moses sees God making these decorations on the letters. And Moses says, Lord of the universe, who stays thy hand? Meaning, why are you doing this? Why are you decorating these letters in such an artistic way? And God says, there will arise a man at the end of many generations, Akiva, the son of Yosef, who will expound upon each tittle, each little line and dot that I'm drawing, heaps and heaps of laws. Now, this is, of course, a little bit of rabbinic hyperbole, because Rabbi Akiva has an incredibly expansive approach, but not quite that expansive. But he does, for instance, read a significance into things like the word et, that Hebrew word that comes before a direct object. Okay, but not quite this expansive. So Akiva says, Rabbi Akiva says, Lord of the universe, permit me to see him. So God replied, turn around. And then suddenly Moses is transported to Rabbi Akiva's classroom. Moses went and sat down behind 8 rows. Now that already is an indicator to us of what's going to follow, because in the rabbinic classroom, you sat in a hierarchy of who was the most learned. So it's like with an orchestra. So Moses was already seated in the last row with the worst students. And that's exactly how it's going to play out. Moses went and sat down behind 8 rows, and he listened to the discourses upon the law. He had no comprehension of what they were saying, so his spirit became weak. But when they came to a certain subject, and the disciples said to their master, Rabbi Akiva, how do you know this? And Rabbi Akiva replied, it is a law given unto Moses at Sinai. Then Moses' spirit was revived. Now, why is Moses comforted in this? Let's assume Moses, we're told, is the paradigm of humility. Right? The Torah says explicitly no one was as humble as Moses. So he's in Rabbi Akiva's classroom. He's attending a Torah class. He's the one who received the Torah. He doesn't understand anything that's happening. And he feels comforted when Rabbi Akiva says, in response to a question, Torah l'Moshe miSinai. This is a teaching of Moses at Sinai. Yeah. He's comforted by the awareness of continuity. And what's amazing about this story, how many people have encountered this story before? It's one of, about half the group. It's one of famous agadot of the Talmud. It's an amazing admission from the Talmudic rabbis. This is a way that the rabbis of the Talmud say about their own project. If Moses were to come today back to earth, he wouldn't recognize this as Judaism. And they're okay with that. They're proud of that. They're connecting that with Torah l'Moshe miSinai. They understand that the Torah is an expansive, interpretive tradition. It's interpretive in a particular period of time, and it's expansive and interpretive over the long arc of time. So I want to stop for a few minutes. These were sort of some sample texts to make a case for the elasticity of the way we understand Torah. And before we move on to talk about the elasticity of the way we understand God, I just want to open it up for a few responses, questions, comments, please. So let me just, for the simulcast, I'm supposed to repeat that it's not just that the rabbis are okay with it, but the rabbis see Moses being okay with the fact that his Torah has developed to such a degree that he wouldn't really be able to follow the argument. Right. So the rabbis were proto-deconstructionists. I mean, that's kind of my teacher. If I understand his writing and his teaching correctly, that's kind of what Mark Alain Waknin is arguing. The rabbis were proto-deconstructionists. They were proto-postmodern. They were pre-modern postmoderns. Please. Although here, in the example of Moses interpreting it by adding, don't go near a woman, it's sort of not exactly this interpretive process, let's say, that you're attributing to him, and I think it's a good read. It doesn't lead in kind of a more liberal direction. It leads in a more conservative direction, but it could go, it's going to go either way. Judith Plaskow in Standing Again at Sinai, is that? Standing at Sinai. So this is very important to her in the development of a feminist critique of Judaism. So thank you for that. Yes. Yeah. So you're emphasizing the sense of continuity, that Moses' comfort comes from the fact that he's assured by Rabbi Akiva's comment that this is an outgrowth. This conclusion, this teaching of Rabbi Akiva's is an outgrowth of the same Torah that Moses received. It's consistent. Right. So we can read that story as kind of enhancing our discussion by talking about something in elasticity. Something has to be holding, and so here you're saying Moses' sense of comfort comes from knowing that there's a direct line of continuity and consistency with the past. Yeah, or he's hearing that in the response. And this is like, the big question that the $64,000 question that we're not going to have a chance to develop very deeply this evening is, okay, so what are the boundaries of this elasticity? And you're already hinting at this, that elasticity is not the same as a free-for-all. There has to be some sense of consistency and continuity with the past. Please. Well, that might be why it's so important that our revelation is a revelation of words. That built into that is already, you're saying there's like an inevitability of multiple meanings as soon as you put a word down on the page. The rabbis are maximizing that. I mean, you saw that with the little Agadah of the Torah says, Asher Shibarta, which you smashed. And they're hearing... It's not that those words can mean this. It's that orally, it sounds a little bit like Yasher Koach. They might actually be playing with the word. It's pretty flexible. They may be, it might be derived by something a little bit less free associative, which is asher can sound like ashrei, like praiseworthy is the fact that you shattered them. Like ashrei yoshvei vetecha, happy or this. Yeah, that's what they're doing. But yeah, well, okay, you don't like the extra word. You're fine with the yasher, but the koach, where is that coming from? Yeah.
What's the difference between elasticity and a slippery slope?
Yeah, so that's that's part of that $64,000 question. The difference between elasticity and a slippery slope, and this is going to form the substance of our debates. And we could probably shape. We won't have time tonight, but a whole list of criteria that maybe we could all agree on. That would be that test. In other words, we would ask certain things to determine whether this is a legitimate interpretation, whether this is a helpful interpretation. The rabbis themselves derived hermeneutical principles, rules for interpreting the Torah, and this is an important question to responsibly rein in what potentially could be incredibly chaotic. Yeah, we'll take just two more comments, and then we'll go on to the elasticity with regard to our understanding of God.
Well, I find it interesting that we see here he had no comprehension. That's pretty dramatic. And then at one point they mentioned Torah mi Sinai, Moshe mi Sinai, and his spirit was revived. That's a pretty thin reed. I have the sense of so much that is not within his realm of understanding, and then there's something. But as something sustainable, it's a shaky traction that he has. So I'm delighted that the consensus seems to be the strong sense of continuity, but it seems to me it's a pretty weak sense.
In other words, if it's only a matter of the answer to a question is, oh, well, this was Halakha Moshe mi Sinai. This was a law from Moses at Sinai. Yeah. I mean, that's, again, what makes this, I think, such a... it's so amazing that the rabbis were willing to shape a story like this. And it's filled with... they're even comfortable kind of overstating their point. That Moses didn't understand a word of the lesson, like, that he's in the very last row, like, couldn't he be in the middle somewhere? Maybe he's not an A student, but he's not a D student. But no, they want him in this context to be a D student. This term, halacha l'Moshe mi Sinai, usually has a more precise definition of a certain category of Jewish law, which, one way to explain it is it's law that's derived by the rabbis, d'Rabbanan, that has the status of Torah law. But here, I think it just means something more general. Right, God seemed to have placed him, right? God found just the right place. I mean, that, again, enhances this story.
I would feel better about the elasticity, which I think is essential, if there are learned people doing the interpretation. For example, like Midrash. There's some Midrash that you read that really makes sense and relates to the Torah portion. There's other that I think is tremendous stretch. And frequently I think it depends on who's doing the Midrash. If Alter or Rambam or somebody is doing the interpretation, then I can understand the elasticity. If I'm doing the interpretation, no, it's not acceptable to me.
Okay, so this is, I'm really glad that you said this, because this is the other part of that $64,000 question, and you'll help us to kind of lay it out very clearly. So one question on the table that we won't be able to resolve tonight are, what are the boundaries and limits of interpretation? What are the rules for interpretation? How do we determine whether this is consistent or in continuity with the past. The other, which is the issue that you're raising, is an issue of authority. Who has the authority to interpret? Does everybody have the authority to interpret? Do just rabbis have the authority to interpret? Do just, and this is, that second question, by the way, could be understood to be the way in which we divide up along denominational lines. It's one way of explaining the difference for all that these labels are kind of becoming fuzzy and losing a lot of their precision. One mapping of the American Jewish denominational world is the answer to your question. However you answer who has the authority to make these interpretive decisions will in some ways determine whether you're Reform, Conservative, or Orthodox. I want to transition into the second part, which I called somewhat provocatively the elasticity of God. It's really the elasticity of our understanding of God, the elasticity of our perception of God. So I want to look with you. This is another part of the exact same text that we were looking at earlier with regard to Torah, the text from Pesikta de Rav Kahana that had to do with the Torah being likened to manna and each person tasting it and experiencing it differently. So here, this is a midrash on the very first commandment of the Ten Commandments. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. And the midrash says, because the Holy One, blessed be he, had appeared to them at the sea like a heroic soldier doing battle, and appeared to them at Sinai like a teacher teaching the reception of traditions, and appeared to them in the time of Daniel like a sage teaching Torah, and appeared to them in the time of Solomon like a younger man. It was necessary for the Holy One, blessed be he, to say to them, you see me in many forms, but I am the same one who was at the sea. I am the same one who was at Sinai. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. This is, I think, an incredibly profound spiritual text. God is one and unchanging, but since our understanding is limited, we see God, we perceive God in different ways at different periods of our life, different periods of our national life, the life of the Jewish people, and maybe different ways in periods of our own lives, right? If you think about how you understood God when you were 6 years old and how you understand God now, this is a midrash that makes room for that. This is a midrash that argues that we are so far from being able to understand and talk about and think about God that we will imagine God and relate to God and understand God in very different ways in different periods. A more provocative version of that statement is found in source number 9. Many of you are familiar with the Amidah, the standing silent prayer, the central prayer of every service, HaTefilah, the prayer. And the first blessing of the Amidah, the Avot, contains the words which describe God as Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'Hanora. El Elyon. Okay, so don't get to the El Elyon, but Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'Hanora. Anybody know who wrote those words? According to the Torah, Moses wrote those words. That Moses in Deuteronomy calls God Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'Hanora. Here we're translating it as the great, mighty, and awesome God. Great, mighty, and awesome. So look with me, source number 9. We're going to start 7 lines down where it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines down, where it says, for Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said. See where we are? Why were they called the men of the great synod? Here it's Anshe HaKnesset HaGadolah. This is the group of sages who lived just before the period that we call the rabbis. And it's attributed to them, the Amidah is attributed to them, and most of the Siddur, or much of the principal parts of the prayer book are attributed to this group. And Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says, why were they called the men of the great assembly? Because they restored the crown of the divine attributes to its ancient completeness. For Moses had come and said, Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor V'Hanorah, the great God, mighty and awesome. Okay? Then what happened? So we have Moses with all 3 adjectives. Or they're not adjectives, they're nouns, but they're descriptive nouns. Somebody help me here. What are they? Attributes. Okay. Hagadol, Hagibor, V'Hanorah. So that was Moses. And then came Jeremiah. What did Jeremiah experience, the prophet Jeremiah? The destruction of Jerusalem, the first destruction, 586 BCE. Then came Jeremiah and said, aliens are destroying his temple. Where are then his awesome deeds? And so he omitted the attribute Hanorah, awesome. Jeremiah, the prophet, according to this, said, I can't call God Hanorah anymore, awesome. I've just witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. I'm taking that off, and I'm just going to refer to God as he does in a verse as Ha'el Hagadol V'Hagibor. Then what happens? Then Daniel came, who's living during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, and said, aliens are enslaving God's sons. Where are God's mighty deeds? And so Daniel omits the word mighty, Hagibor. And then come the men of the great assembly, and they say, on the contrary, therein lie his mighty deeds, that God suppresses God's wrath, that God extends long suffering to the wicked. And therein lies his awesome powers, Hanorah. But for the fear of him, how could one single nation persist among the many nations? So you have this kind of dialogue through Jewish history of what are we able to call God? And God originally was called great and powerful and awesome. And then the historical experiences of the prophets took off some of those attributes. And then the men of the great assembly, says this Gemara, restored those attributes. So then they ask the question that we're all asking. How could the earlier rabbis, and here they don't really mean rabbis, they mean the prophet Jeremiah and Daniel, how could they abolish something established by Moses? How did they have the chutzpah to take away attributes of God that Moses himself established? How could they put T-Pex, whiteout, over the words awesome and powerful when it came to God? And the answer here is stunning. Rabbi Elazar said, since they knew that the Holy One, blessed be he, insists on truth, they would not ascribe false things to him. Say, God, if God represents anything, God represents truth. We're told that truth is God's name, that God's seal, the way that ancient kings had seals, God's seal is the word truth. Anybody go to Brandeis here? right? So that's why Brandeis's insignia says emet, truth, because according to the Midrash, that's God's seal. God's insignia says truth. So if God's name is truth and God's seal is truth, they simply couldn't bring themselves in their age, given what they experienced in their period of time, they couldn't say God is awesome, and they couldn't say God is powerful. That this is the answer of Rabbi Elazar is really very powerful and seems to suggest, well, let me ask you, what does it suggest? What do you make of Rabbi Elazar's response? That since God's name is truth, they couldn't say something about God that they didn't experience as true. Okay, so you're not so comfortable with them deleting. Okay. The men of the Great Assembly are taking a larger view, or Rabbi Elazar is taking a larger view. Yeah, yeah. Please. In other words, to stand in the aftermath of the temple's destruction and in exile in Babylonia, and to say, God is awesome, it doesn't feel like a kind of spiritual leadership that people are going to be able to follow. Right, right. It kind of discredits the whole system. I love this text. I love that. Yeah, please. God doesn't want a bunch of yes men and yes women. Yes, please. Yeah, yeah. David Hartman, I love Hashalom. Right, the God who hates lies. So, yes. And there's not only is this like an amazing text because it's ascribing this kind of skepticism, or call it what you will, to Jeremiah the prophet and Daniel, but it also kind of receives a stamp of approval from the rabbis, both because the story's in the Talmud and because Rabbi Elazar says, look, what did you want from them? God's name is truth. They had to basically tell the truth as they saw it.
Seems to me that part of this is a recognition that as human beings, we have a limited sense of things. And that whereas God is great, he's strong, great, whatever, and awesome, that's a universal truth, perspective, okay? Whereas these individuals in their time as human beings could not, in truth, comprehend all of that.
Very, very nicely said. We're going to skip text number 10, but we're going to go to text number 11, which is a little bit of a pushing the envelope here to bring in Mordechai Kaplan. Mordechai Kaplan was the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. This is from a book of his called The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion, but his magnum opus is called Judaism as a Civilization. And Mordechai Kaplan despite the fact that Reconstructionism is the smallest movement in American Jewish life, I think the overwhelming majority of American Jews, if you ask them to describe what is their Judaism, what does it mean to be Jewish, they're closer to Kaplan and to Reconstructionism than any other philosophy or theology. Kaplan rejects the notion of a supernatural God and speaks of God as the power that makes for salvation. If we were to use more contemporary language today, we would say something like the power that makes for goodness and transformation in the world. We'll read what Kaplan writes here. Only by way of participation in human affairs and strivings are we to seek God. We seek God whenever we explore truth, goodness, and beauty to their uttermost reaches. This is a radically different, a radically elastic notion of God. A lot of people in Kaplan's day, Kaplan lived to be over 100 years old, and he influenced generations of not just Reconstructionists, but conservative and Reform rabbis. His critics, by the way, would say, there is no God and Mordechai Kaplan is his prophet. But I think he's doing something quite profound here. He's saying, in a way, we could argue about whether it's an extension of Rabbi Elazar and the story from the Talmud that we just read, or whether it goes too far. But he's saying, don't lose the concept and the notion of God, but be open to seeing God in the world in a very different way than it was traditionally, than Jews have traditionally perceived God in the world. I don't want to talk about limits, but I wanted to bring this because I think that for a lot of, I do believe in a supernatural God, but I think that many modern, postmodern people who don't, Kaplan is a way into the language and the concept of talking about God in very, very different terms. I think it's a kind of much richer, more imaginative form of humanism that allows for the vocabulary of God and allows for prayer and allows for ritual, though God is, for him, a process.
Well, if God is a process, where's the sense of God being available as relational and other? That's one thing that troubles me about Kaplan, a force. You don't have a relationship to a force. The force is within you. You have a relationship to other, whatever that is, whether it's natural or supernatural, it's other. It's ironic because I would agree with you that Reconstructionism, in terms of its liturgy, in terms of having the ark off to the side a little bit, and therefore not necessarily off to the side so that one can explore it, but also relate to the human community as it is. And other aspects of Reconstructionism, I think, are quite valid, but I think this major Kaplan notion of God is a substantial variance with what you believe.
Look, what you're talking about are real limits in his theology, but it opens up a lot of doors as well. I don't want to dwell so much on Kaplan as much as this notion of the elasticity of our understanding of God. And I want to just be sure, I know there's some hands up, but I want to be able to kind of close the circle on this last component, and then we'll have a little bit of time to open it up. The Beit Midrash, the study hall, is the primary institution of Jewish life that we get from the rabbis, more than the synagogue. The place, this is your Beit Midrash. So the Beit Midrash has to be the place that holds and somehow institutionalizes this elastic notion of Torah and this elastic set of ways that we have of perceiving God. I love the fact that the word midrash, beit, bait, house, midrash, we usually translate it in the context of beit midrash as study, a house of study. But midrash comes from the Hebrew word doresh, to seek out. This is a house for seekers, a house for people who are searching. So I think that if we think of the Beit Midrash as a house of seeking and searching, it points to the fact that that we encounter the text, when we encounter the text and when we encounter and search for God, we're in the position of being a seeker. We can't see and grasp the full meaning of a text. It's elusive. It's always, there's an interpretation that we haven't heard. There's a direction that we haven't gone in. There's something about the text that we don't understand. And there's always something about God that we can't capture, that we can't fully understand. And the Beit Midrash, I think, holds both of those impulses. So I want to look with you text source number 12 and source number 13 are about a kind of elasticity that the Beit Midrash has to have. And I would say it's an inclusiveness, but these present two different kinds of inclusiveness. The first text we're going to look at, text number 12, is about the inclusiveness of subject matter in the Beit Midrash. And text number 13 is about the inclusiveness of people, of participants. So number 12, this is from the speech in 1920 of Franz Rosenzweig, a leading German Jewish intellectual, one of the most important Jewish theologians of the 20th century, of his opening speech of the first Center for Adult Jewish Learning in Germany that he called the Lehrhaus. His translation of Beit Midrash into German was Lehrhaus, a learning house. And he's envisioning, what does a 20th century Beit Midrash look like? What's the curriculum for a 20th century Beit Midrash? A new learning is about to be born. Rather, it has been born. It is a learning in reverse order. A learning that no longer starts from the Torah and leads into life. Sorry for the typo. But the other way round. From life, from a world that knows nothing of the law or pretends to know nothing, back to the Torah. That is the sign of the time. He develops this more, that classically, let's say before modernity, all you studied was Torah, and then you learned an occupation. So you somehow applied your Torah learning to the real world. And he says, no, the kind of Jewish learning that has to take place in modernity has to start with the world and then take everything that you're learning from the world and bring it into the world of Jewish study. Look at the last paragraph. It is not a matter of pointing out relations between what is Jewish and what is non-Jewish. There has been enough of that. It is not a matter of apologetics, but rather of finding the way back into the heart of our life and of being confident that this heart is a Jewish heart. So he thinks everything from the world at large, if we're serious about our Jewish lives and we're serious about our commitment to learning, we can lead everything in life back into the Torah. So that's an inclusiveness of subject matter. Everything's open. Everything has to be somehow integrated. That we have to allow the world to be a commentary on the Torah. Source number 13 is a famous text about who gets to study in the Beit Midrash. How inclusive is this place that houses an elastic notion of Torah and an elastic notion of God? So there's a new rabbi in town. There's a new general, a new king. Rabban Gamliel, who had been the leader of the Jewish community, is deposed, and a young guy, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, is in his place. And the first thing Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah does, you know Elazar ben Azariah from the Pesach Seder, where he says, I am like a man of 70, because he was appointed as head of the Jewish court when he was quite young. And the Midrash says that, he immediately, his beard turned gray, and he had to take on the look of an old man. So one of the first changes that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah makes is allowing for a more inclusive population to enter the Beit Midrash. There was a fundamental change in the general approach of the study hall as they dismissed the guard at the door and permission was granted to the students to enter. Rabban Gamliel's criteria was the only people that can study here are people whose inside is like their outside. A very, very high bar of character. But Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says everybody's welcome here. On that day, skip down to about 2/3 of the way down. On that day, the day that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah became the head, several benches were added to the study hall to accommodate the numerous students. And then there's a typical rabbinic debate about, well, how many extra people came? Rabbi Yochanan said Abba Yosef ben Dostai, and the rabbis disputed this matter. One said 400 benches were added to the study hall, and one said 700 benches were added to the study hall. There were a lot of students, and centuries later, people were still trying to recall how many more students were able to enter the Beit Midrash. What does it mean in a system that for whom expansiveness and elasticity is so central, to have a bar that's so high? What's the impact of having such a high bar and such an exclusionary set of rules? Can God and Torah flourish in all of their expansiveness if people have limited access? Does greater access enable for an even greater expansiveness? These are the kinds of questions that this raises. Finally, I want to look at, and this is our last text, at a story that we won't read the whole story of. It's one of the most famous rabbinic stories, and usually in rabbinical circles, you only have to say, Lo bashamayim hi, the Torah's not in heaven. And it's like, the punchline where you don't have to tell the joke because everybody knows. So everybody knows this story. This is a story that is cited to show that human beings, with all of our flaws and all of our limitations, we determine what the Torah means for our particular age. This is a story that asserts that even if a voice were to cry out from heaven saying, we're wrong, it doesn't matter because we do the best we can. We determine what the Torah means. We determine what the law is. And we no longer have the kind of relationship with God that has us listening to voices from heaven. That's not how rabbinic Judaism works. We hear God's voice through the text. But I want to call, just glancing at this, how many people have studied this story before? Okay, so about half. Because of time, we're not going to read the whole story, but I want to focus in on a little detail of the story that even for those of us who have read this story dozens and dozens of times, this piece might not have stood out for us. What happens is there's a debate between Rabbi Eliezer, who has one opinion, and all the rest of the rabbis who disagree with him. And in this rabbinic system of not listening for divine voices from heaven, it's majority rule. The majority of the sages determine what the halakha is. But Rabbi Eliezer knows that he's right objectively, and so he calls all of these proofs, and he says, if I'm right, make the stream flow the other direction, and the stream goes the other direction. And if I'm right, uproot this carob tree from one side of the road to the other side of the road. And it happens. And the majority of rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, they're not impressed by this. They're not impressed by trees jumping to the other side of the road. And they're not even impressed at the end of the story where Rabbi Eliezer says, if I'm right, let a voice from heaven call out that I'm right. And they hear a voice from heaven that says, Rabbi Eliezer is right. And that's when the punchline comes and they say, you told us in the book of Deuteronomy, the Torah is not in heaven. They quote back to God, you stay out of this. We determine. But the part that I want to read for our purposes of thinking about the Beit Midrash is look what happens in this story to the Beit Midrash. Rabbi Eliezer said, this is the bold part, if the law is as I say, the walls of the house of study of the Beit Midrash will prove it. The walls of the house of study inclined to fall, started to fall. Rabbi Yoshua protested at the walls, saying to them, if scholars defeat or debate each other in the law, why does it bother you? How does it better you? In other words, Rabbi Yoshua is saying to the walls of the Beit Midrash that start to fall down, you walls stay out of this. And then we're told the walls did not fall because of the honor of Rabbi Yehoshua, but they did not straighten because of the honor of Rabbi Eliezer. And they still incline and stand. And the Hebrew is va'adayin mat'in va'omdim. To this very day, the walls of the Beit Midrash are neither straight, nor did they fall down. What might be the meaning of these leaning walls? A Beit Midrash is grounded in an elastic notion of Torah and God, and so it has to be a house that allows opposing ideas to live together. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. And honoring opposing sides is the way for the culture of the Beit Midrash. That's the way to support a roof. That's a way to keep a roof over your head by these leaning, slanted walls that are slanted because they're honoring both opinions. Perhaps the walls make it so that no one wins. The wording that's used here that Rabbi Yoshua says to the walls, the wording that's used to say, but out of this, is Im talmidei chachamim minatzchim ze et ze bahalacha, atem ma tivchem. So maybe the walls make sure that nobody wins. These leaning walls of the Beit Midrash don't result in a winner. And such a Beit Midrash, we're told, stands to this very day. I think that's an aspirational statement of the rabbis. They still lean to this very day. The walls of this Beit Midrash, the Talmud wants to tell us, lean to this very day. In the embrace of Torah that can be read and heard and interpreted in a multiplicity of ways, and in our search for a closeness to God who supports, who goes beyond our understanding, and a search for a closeness to a God who can be experienced and perceived in changing and unfolding ways, may we all merit finding refuge in a Beit Midrash with leaning walls that do not fall. And may our learning here bring us closer to Torah, to God, and to one another.
Good ending time. I just want to thank Rabbi Morris for being here with us. Are you rushing out? You're here. So if there are some questions people have, please feel free to come up and say hello. And thank you for coming. In March, we're going to be looking at the topic. In March, we're going to be looking at hubris and humility. We're going to be talking about that line between self-confident and arrogant, and the line between humble and self-negation, that right in there. And so if you haven't been to an open Beit Midrash yet, please come. It's always the first Tuesday of the month. You'll be hearing about Rabbi James Jacobson Meisels, who will be with us for the course of about 4 days, including the second Tuesday of the month. We look forward to learning together again. Thank you for coming. Rabbi Morris, thank you for bringing your wisdom to this Beit Midrash and keeping our walls exactly as they ought to be, which is right here in Sacred Conversation.